Pleasant day to you, matriculants. It is my pleasure to invite you to this discussion, the memo discussion for history paper 2 for the session of November. Right, so what we're going to do, we're just going to go through the paper and we're going to discuss the possible responses to the questions. Right, this is our national paper for November 2025. Right, understand the marks is always out of 150 and the paper is administered in 3 hours. And our focus areas, we understand paper 2 is made up of the 3 questions, source-based questions, and 3 questions, essay typical questions. And our first question is on civil resistance. Our second question is the coming of democracy and the coming to terms with the past. That is question number 2 for source-based question. Then number 3 is the end of Cold War and the New World Order events after 1989 to present. Then we also have our section B for essay questions. You're going to look at civil resistance in the 1970s to 1980s. Its focus is South African crisis of apartheid in the 1980s. Then the coming of democracy to South Africa and the coming to terms with the past, question number 5. And lastly, question number 6 is the end of Cold War and a New World Order events of 1989. Right, without wasting time, we're going to go to question number 1. We're going to be as brief as is possible to just highlight the questions and the answers. Right, court evidence from the source, which suggests that COSATU was the largest federation of black workers' union in South Africa in November 1985. Right, coming to our source, we understand our source is saying in November 1985, more than 33 unions joined together to form the Congress of South African Trade Unions, COSATU, the largest federation group of black workers in South African history, with a total membership of 500,000 workers. So basically, that is where we extract our response. We are seeing that it was a formation which was made up of 33 unions that joined together to form COSATU, and it was the largest grouping of black workers in South African history with a total membership of 500,000 workers, which is 500,000. Right, that is question number 1.11. 1.12, it says define the term non-parliamentary opposition group in your own words. Non-parliamentary opposition group. By the context of non-parliamentary, we are saying it did not have parliamentary representation. So we are saying in this instance, it's a formation without parliamentary representation. A formation without parliamentary representation seeking to challenge the white rule. Without parliamentary representation, which is seeking to challenge the white rule. That's basically the idea of non-parliamentary opposition group. It means that the group will be opposing the rule of apartheid, but it doesn't have any representation in parliament. So that's the term non-parliamentary opposition group. I'd explain what can be inferred or implied by the statement. COSATU has allied itself to the aims, if not formally to the structures, of the banned and exiled African National Congress. Explain what can be inferred by COSATU had allied itself. What it means here, when we are saying COSATU had allied itself, we are saying, it's number 113, we can say COSATU had the same aims of removing the government. Similar as the ANC. So it has allied itself in the sense that it had the same aims. It was advocating for the same move to remove the apartheid government. Or can say the leadership board of COSATU resembled that of ANC. That's the other implication. You can say the leadership board of COSATU resembled that of the ANC. When it says the structures, we're looking at how it was structured in terms of its leadership. So the leadership also resembled that of the ANC in other terms. Right, moving on to the next question. Our next question is saying, using the information in the source and your own knowledge, state why you think industrial trade unions grew stronger in the 1980s. Why did industrial trade unions grew stronger in the 1980s? Right, we are looking at the period of the 1980s and try to analyze what happened in the 1980s. That is question number 1.1.4. Right, in the 1980s, the first thing is black trade unionism. Black trade unions were legalized in the sense that, remember, trade unionism on the side of the blacks was made illegal by the apartheid government. But however, because of the reform to apartheid, they did relax some of those conditions. It allowed black trade unions to operate. So for the same reason, that is why the trade unions got to become strong in the 1980s, because now they were legally allowed to operate. And also, you can look at the aspect of, besides, it was fueled by the influence of the trade unions, were fueled by poor working conditions, poor wages, and disrespect of workers' rights. They also became strong because the fueling factor was poor working conditions in the workplace. So they became stronger in the advocating for the fight against poor working conditions and also poor wages. Remember, they were even fighting for the living wage and also disrespect of workers' rights in the workplace. They became stronger in the fight against those evils in the workplace. And also, we can talk of in the 1980s. Remember, there was also the influence of black consciousness. So black consciousness also played a significant role in mobilizing the Africans to try and resist against unfair practices in the workplace. They also advocated for the fight against the inhuman practices that were done by the apartheid government in the treatment of the workers in the workplace. So for that same reason, we can also justify that they were getting stronger in the sense that they were now being infused by the ideas of Steve Biko and the Black Consciousness Movement. So because of the same reason, they were made to be conscientized. They were conscientized of the need to uphold their identity and also to have self-pride as a unique group of people. So the same principles applied to labor unions, and they also had to uphold strength in the side of on the side of the fight against ill treatment in the workplace. So it was also one of the fueling factors. Then you can also look at solidarity. Black solidarity in the form of COSATU. Remember, they became stronger because at the end, they decided to form a coalition. All trade unions, instead of them fighting as divided units, they chose to unite and fight as one body. And for that reason, they became stronger because of the fact that they were now united as part of the COSATU moving as a movement, as a trade union controlling all the activities of other formations which came to be part of it. Right. So those are some of the reasons. I'll move on to question number source B. Source B says, comment on the significance of comment Comment on the significance of holding this COSATU rally on 1 May 1986. Comment on the significance of this COSATU rally on 1 May 1986. Right. This is question number 121. Significance of holding that rally. That's number 121. It was held on the 1st of May. It was ultimately a COSATU rally, which was held on the 1st of May in 1986. 1 May 1986. But what was the significance of that particular rally? What was the significance of the gathering of COSATU? So basically, the main idea was to unite workers in the fight against unjust labor practices. So it was ultimately to unite workers to fight against unjust labor practices in the workplace. COSATU ultimately united workers in that particular rally. And also we can highlight that the meeting was also significant to remind the government of the need in this instance, we are saying the government and employers. It was also a call by COSATU to remind employers and the government of the need for them to respect workers' rights. And ultimately, we understand 1 May, it was a significant meeting that also led to the recognition of workers' rights as the Workers' Day or the May Day. Remember, the 1st of May is a public holiday, but it was a public holiday across the region, but not in South Africa. South Africa was disrespecting that particular holiday. They were not recognizing it as part of the South African calendar of holidays. But however, it led to the government to recognize such a day as a day of the workers, as the May Day. It later on gives the government the insight into recognizing the day as the Workers' Day or the May Day because of that particular reason, which was fostered out in the form of the meeting by COSATU to try and remind the government of the need to uphold humanity in the workplace and also respect the rights of the worker. Right. We take it to the next question. Our next question is question number 122. What is inferred or what is implied by the words forward with the workers' struggle in the context of mass action against apartheid government in the 1980s? Forward with the workers' struggle. Right, the implication there, when we are saying forward with the workers' struggle, we are saying forward with the workers' struggle. What is the implication there? It implies that workers were to keep fighting against the injustices of apartheid in the workplace. So when it says forward with the armed workers' struggle, it means the struggle here is workers were supposed to keep on fighting against the injustices that were happening in the workplace. They were supposed to keep on with the fight against the malpractices that were done to the labor by the apartheid government and apartheid employers. Then we move on to the next question. Next question is saying, Explain the symbolism of the clenched fists in the banner of some of the workers in the photograph. If you are to check, we are seeing they have got clenched fists. So the symbol, what is the meaning or the implication of the clenched fists in that instance? You want to highlight, figure out why are they using that symbol of clenched fists. Right. So when you're using the clenched fists, what do they mean? Right. With clenched fists, we are saying they signify powerful, resistance and solidarity and strength. So the rationale of the clenched fist is to signify powerful resistance, which meant that the black workers were fighting against apartheid in a powerful way. They were having the power in their hands to fight against the oppression of apartheid. And also it meant that they were fighting for a common cause. They were united in the fight for a common cause, solidarity, and also strength. It implied that they had the power to foster and persist in the fight against oppression by apartheid authorities. Right, I'll move on to the next question. Next question saying, refer to source 1A and 1B. Explain how the information in source 1A supports the visual evidence in source 1B regarding COSATU's mass mobilization against the apartheid government. Right, that is a comparison question. By comparison, we are saying we must find similarities in the two sources. A factor which is highlighted in source 1A, which is also portrayed in the other source, which is source 1B. So we must identify similarities between those two sources and figure out how we can relate the two sources. Right, let's go to the sources and factor out ideas. Right, if we check on the sources, we must figure out ideas that you can use to compare the two sources. Right, it says here, from the onset of the source, the first paragraph, it talks about source 1A says more than 33 unions joined together, more than 33 unions. And how is it similar to this one? This one is saying the Congress of South African Trade Unions in the Western Cape on 1 May 1986, it shows workers participating in a protest under the banner of the Commercial Catering Allied Workers Union of South Africa. So we are seeing that the banner here, it resembled some sections which were falling under the COSATU. It was an affiliate, one of the affiliates of COSATU. So by saying that there were unions which became part of the COSATU by 33 unions which joined together, it is also supporting that because it's showing us one of the affiliates here, the Allied Workers Union of South Africa, the Commercial Catering and Allied Workers Union of South Africa is one of the affiliates, which means it's one of those 33 who joined. So it's supporting each other. Then if you also look at source 1A, it talks about a total membership of 500,000 workers, 50,000 workers in total of COSATU, which is supported also by these masses that you are seeing here. There is a very big group of black workers. There is a large mass of workers here, which suggests that the 500,000 group in total is also portrayed as part of, this is a part of the group of 500,000. By showing us these large masses of people, it gives us a clue that COSATU became a very big institution in the fight against oppression by apartheid authorities. Then what else can we talk about? It also says here, and in the critical mining industries, labor leaders claim the support. The labor leaders had the support of half of 600,000 men black workforce. So it also suggests that half of 600,000 were part of the supporters of the leaders of COSATU. And the suggestion is also indicated here by the numbers. As having half of 600,000 men, it also gives us a clue that it was a very big number, which is also supported by the numbers that you are seeing on the image. And also, if you check here, it talks about the nature of the challenge. It says the challenge now posed by black unions is profound or overpowering. It shows that the challenge that was posed by the black South African unions, it was overpowering, it was profound, it was overpowering. How is it suggested? By the clenched fist here. It shows strength and it showed powerful resistance. They were powerful in their resistance against oppression. So it's supporting each other. What you are seeing in source 1A is also given as evidence of a visual presentation in source 1B. Right, that takes us to the next question, which is our question number 1.4.1. Right, the question is saying, identify a campaign in the source that COSATU members conducted through a strike that took several weeks in March 1987. Identify a campaign in the source. This is a level 1 extraction question. You just have to go to the source and look at the campaign. It says COSATU members had been out on a strike for several weeks in March 1987 over grievances that none of us either understood or cared about. It turned out that they were conducting a living wage campaign. So the campaign was a living wage campaign. According to the extract, it's a living wage campaign. That was the campaign. Explain the term grievances in the context of COSATU's activities against apartheid. Grievances in the context of COSATU's activities. Right. So here, this is a context question. We must contextualize to COSATU in its fight against apartheid. That is number 1.4.2. Right. 1.4.2. We are looking at grievances in the context of COSATU. Grievances here, we are looking at concerns, or we can say typical challenges. Or problems. So, in the context of COSATU, the grievances were poor working conditions, that workers were exposed to. By the apartheid government. And white employers. It's typical of a grievance here, as in context. We are looking at poor working conditions. We are looking at one of the problems or challenges that the black workers faced in the workplace. So it was a grievance in the sense that it was a challenge that the workers faced in the workplace. They were exposed to poor working conditions. And also you can highlight other grievances like poor wages that were paid to black African workers. It was also a grievance. For them ending up conducting a living wage campaign, it was meaning that they were earning below the living wage. They were earning below the minimum wage required to sustain a normal life. They were living below the poverty line. So the implication is they were ultimately fighting against such an irregularity of paying a worker a wage which does not sustain a normal life. So it was a grievance. You can look at other grievances like segregation in the workplace. It's also a grievance that was faced with white workers. Remember, facilities were segregated. They were not using the same facilities with the whites. You look at the disrespect of rights of workers. Workers' rights were not respected. It was a concern. The disrespect of humanity, the dignity of the African worker in the workplace. Those are some of the concerns that we can highlight as grievances in the context of COSATU's fight against apartheid. Quote 3 pieces of evidence from the source which suggests that the young recruits were terrified This is an account of white police officers who were apparently trying to disperse a group of protesting black workers who were on a living wage campaign. So they were terrified. How were they terrified? We are told that it says the sound almost scared the life out of me. It means was very scared. The sound almost scared the life out of me. It was a terrifying sight. And the other terrifying part is they were armed with knob carries, whips, knives, and a whole variety of vicious or dangerous weapons. So that is where we extract our quotations from the source. That is where we get our 3 extracts from the source. Right. Comment on the limitation of this source to a historian researching the clash between COSATU and the Eastern Riot Squad in March 1987. Right. What can we say here are the limitations? We are saying this source is limited. How is it limited? Right. It's limited in the context that is biased. Does not give the account of COSATU. So it's biased in the sense that it's one-sided. It only gives us the side of the apartheid government, the police side, but ignores the side of the COSATU. And how is it also limited? Besides it giving us a one-sided view, besides it being limited in the sense that it was only giving us a view of the apartheid era, the apartheid side, we can also look at it in the perspective that it gives exaggerated facts. If you check there, they are saying they were armed with knob carries, whips, knives, and a whole variety of vicious, dangerous weapons. We understand that might be exaggerated. That police officers account how they come to the extent of realizing all those weapons at once. That the protesters were having knob carries, they were having whips, they were having knives, they were having a whole variety of vicious, dangerous weapons. That is exaggerated facts. It's exaggeration. There is exaggeration there on the weapons carried by COSATU. It shows that it's an exaggeration there. It cannot be a reality. And also, if we check, it can also be limited in the sense, if we try to investigate, it's a propaganda source. There is some element of propaganda there. They wish to tarnish the image of COSATU by labeling COSATU as violent activists who go around carrying dangerous weapons. It was a propaganda. They wanted people to have a bad image of a COSATU. And also it's limited in the sense that it ignores facts about the living wage campaign. It was a grave concern for the COSATU members that they wanted to attain a living wage. They wanted the employers to give them a reasonable amount of earning for their efforts in production. But however, this source ignores that, because if you check where it starts, this account of this guy is just neglecting those facts. It says COSATU members had been on a strike for several weeks in March 1987 over grievances that none of us either understood or cared about. So, which means they were ignoring the effect, the effect to the effect. The effect was the living wage, which gave an effect of the workers going on a protest. But however, they were saying which either none of us understood or cared about. It turned out that they were conducting a living wage campaign heavily backed by the ANC. So they ignored facts there about the living wage campaign. if it was going to be balanced, they were supposed to highlight what the Living Campaign wage was about, what were the grievances, but it ignores those deliberate facts about the Living Wage Campaign. Right. So basically, that is how you can give the limitations of that source in relation to question number 1.4.4. Right. We go to question number 1.5. According to the source, why was COSATU house raided by policemen on 23 April 1987? This is also an extraction question. We just have to go to the source and look at the reasons why the COSATU building was raided by the riot police. It says a shooting incident involving members of the riot unit had occurred here. On 23 April, after a shooting incident involving members of the riot police, COSATU house was raided. So it was after the shooting incident. The incident is the one that facilitated the raid. Using the information, question number 1.5.2, using the information in the source and your own knowledge, explain why the demolition of COSATU house by the security branch was described as unprecedented or unparalleled. Why was it described, the destruction, as unprecedented or unparalleled, meaning it was unmatched? Right, why it was unprecedented, that is number 152. It was unprecedented in the sense that we can say it was after a strong force. For the police to come to the attention of drawing for the fact or to the position of with demolishing the building, it was after a strong force. So it was unparalleled in the sense that they had to use very strong force to get and destroy the building. And also, if we check, we can so argue that COSATU had grown into a very powerful force. So the destruction of the building was unparalleled, was unmatched, because it was not easy for the police to destroy a building which was owned by and controlled by such a huge force, such a strong force, given the membership of COSATU and also given how it was mobilizing the workers. So the fact that COSATU had grown into a very powerful force, it also gives us the image that the police had to use unprecedented force. And also, if we check, police destroyed everything. So it was unparalleled. It was one of the events which had never been seen in the history. Police getting to destroy the whole buildings and all the equipment and infrastructure that was therein. They got to destroy everything. They got to gut the building on fire and let it burn to ashes. That was question number 152. Move on to question number 1.5.3. List 4 ways in the source in which the police demolished the building and its contents during the COSATU house raid. It's an extraction question. We want to look at the ways that were used by the police to destroy. Right. It tells us that what happened here? Doors were promptly closed and the filing cabinets filled with documents and records rained down the confetti, scattering the pieces of paper from balconies. The 10-story building, office equipment was smashed. They smashed office equipment. Then personal computers were tossed, thrown out of the windows and over balconies into the courtyard. Video monitors and an expensive security system were destroyed. What wasn't smashed or broken was stolen. And also it talks about the printing machine. It smashed the plates and the control panel of the printing machine. So basically, those are the ways that were used to destroy the building and also the contents of the building. And also the building itself, it was set on fire. It says completely destroyed. The cars in the basement were also destroyed. Cars in the basement were destroyed and damaged. The members started a fire on the 8th floor. So they destroyed the building using fire, and the equipment, therefore, the cars, they were destroyed in the basement, and the printing machines were also destroyed. The security system and the video monitors, they were also smashed. We look at the office equipment being smashed, personal computers being thrown out of the window. That is basically the idea of the destruction that was done by the security police to the COSATU building. Right. Why do you think that the security branch members misled the firefighters where the fire actually started? Right. We are seeing here at the end of the paragraph, it says, security branch members started a fire on the 8th floor, and when the Johannesburg Fire Department arrived, the firefighters ended up running from floor to floor. They were told by the security branch members that the blaze was upstairs, then downstairs, then out, and so on. Why did they give such information which was wrong? They knew well that they started the fire in the 8th floor, but when they were giving a report to the firefighters, they told them that the fire was upstairs, and then it was downstairs, and then it was out, and all sorts of differing responses. The effect here was they wanted to delay the action of the firefighting. The main reason here is that they wanted to delay the action of the firefighters. This is 154. They did it as a way of, they wanted to delay the firefighters so that the fire grows big, become uncontrollable, and guards down the whole building. That could be the main reason, because they had set this building on fire deliberately. They wanted to destroy COSATU activities. So there was no way they would tell the firefighters the exact position where the fire was, so that the fire would become bigger, would catch on more stuff in the building, and would become uncontrollable, such that the firefighters would, in the event, fail even to control that particular fire, to put it off. So they deliberately delayed them by telling them all those sort of responses, that the fire was upstairs, then it was downstairs, and apparently it was outside, and all those sort of responses. They wanted to delay the action of the firefighters, such that the fire was going to grow big and it was going to gut down or to burn down the whole building and its contents. Right. Then number 154 will take the end of the question. We'll go to the paragraph question. The paragraph question, we are looking at question number 1.6. I'm just going to highlight how best you can respond to that question. Then the evidence, you'll find it in the relevant sources. Right, when you're answering a paragraph question, remember we resort to us using the peel method, where we need to have a point, we need to have explanation, evidence, you'll find it in the sources, then you link. Then your point is the answer to the question. The question is saying, explaining what the different responses were to the attempts of COSATU to mobilize. So we want to focus on the responses to the attempts of COSATU. We know that COSATU was attempting to fight against operation by the government. So what was the reaction here? The different responses. We can start by saying COSATU, first, both positive and negative responses. In its fight, in its attempt to mobilize South African workers. The responses were both negative and positive. Different groups of people responded in a negative way, and some other groups responded in a positive way. Then we go on to explain who was positive. We can explain on the fact that trade unions got to form a strong force, an alliance, to fight against the apartheid government, which is a positive. Then if you look also, the apartheid government, how did it respond? Tried at all costs to hinder or to disturb the mobilization by COSATU. So these were the responses. Positive response from the black workers, they opted to join hands, and the trade unions, they opted to join to have one strong force against apartheid. It is a response. The other response was negative from the apartheid government. They did not want COSATU to mobilize workers. They were trying to destroy its activities. They were trying to disturb its activities. Then you now go on to the sources to pick up relevant evidence. You can use the sources that are relevant. If, for example, you want to look at source 1A, COSATU grew into the largest federation group. It's a supporting evidence to show that it was a positive response, that that trade unions joined, and it ended up being the biggest. It's one form of evidence. The black unions have a propounding or an overpowering implication. Almost half of the 600,000 men of black workforce, they were claimed to be part of the supporters of the Black Labor Union, COSATU. So those are supporting pieces of evidence that you can use. From source B, you can also extract the fact that COSATU managed to hold a very successful meeting on the 1st of May 1986, which showed that was a positive move in the movement of mobilization of people against apartheid. Then you go on to talk about the living wage campaign. It shows positive support to COSATU's activities. If people were going on a campaign against the government paying very little and advocating for the government to pay a living wage, it shows that it was a positive move, a supporting move to the Soweto, to the COSATU's deliberate actions of trying to mobilize the black workers to fight for their rights. Then you can also look at COSATU negative responses, how it got negative responses. Look at how the police responded. The police were also tasked to deal with those people who were engaged in the campaigns. Like here, it talks about there were people who were involved in the campaign having to engage in a clash with the police. And the crowd began to disperse or to go away. It was a negative implication. They were chased away by the police. And also, if we come to source 1D, you can see that they were shooting incidences which were disturbing factors. The raiding of the COSATU building, the destruction of COSATU's property in terms of computers, in terms of equipment, the office equipment, in terms of the monitors, the security systems, the computers, they were all destroyed. It's negative response. So basically, that's the idea. Then at the end of your paragraph, you resort to linking back to your line of argument or to your answer to the question. Your answer is saying COSATU was faced with both positive and negative responses in its attempt to mobilize the African black workers in the fight against oppression by the apartheid government. Then you link back to that line of argument, to that answer. That gives you a full paragraph that can guarantee you to get 8 out of 8, which is a level 3 response. Right, that takes us to the end of question number 1. We move on to question number 2. Question number 2 is a question on the TRC. Why did the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, reject the amnesty application of the perpetrators who tortured Reverend Seunani Farisani? Right, it's a case study here. We're going to look at the questions and try to figure out how best you can respond to those questions. Name from the source 2 organizations within the Black Consciousness movement. in which Farisani served as a founding member. It's an extraction question. We don't want to waste time. It says Farisani was a founding member of the Black People's Convention. It's one, the BPC, and served as its president from 1973 to 75. He worked closely with Steve Bantu Biko and other leaders of the Black Consciousness Movement. He co-founded the Black Evangelical Youth Organization is another. So these two are the responses. State any three types of abuses according to the source that Farisani was subjected to during his imprisonment in 1977 and 1977 and 1987. Right. If we check in the source again, it's an extraction. How was Farisani faced with those maltreatment in his time of imprisonment? Right. It talks about he was subjected to brutal torture, including beatings, electric shocks, and prolonged isolation. Those are some of those abuses that he was exposed to: brutal torture, beatings, electric shocks, and prolonged isolation. Right, we move on to the next part. The next part is saying, explain why Amnesty International declared Farisani as a prisoner of conscience. What does it imply when someone is declared a prisoner of conscience? That is question number 2.1.3. We are talking of a prisoner of conscience. Right, what are we saying there? When we are saying was, we can say he was imprisoned for upholding moral sense. Or in other terms, we can say for upholding an ethical sense of right and wrong. The main reason why he was fighting against the government was because he wanted to uphold morality. What apartheid was doing was against morality. It was ultimately disrespecting the Black people, their dignity, their rights. So he was fighting against that. His conscience told him that what is happening is wrong according to moral principles. Then he was a prisoner of conscience. He was imprisoned for the same reason of upholding morality or ethical principles of the right and the wrong. So basically, that's the idea. Define the term persecution. What is the meaning of the word persecution? And we can define it in simple terms when we're talking of persecution. The concept of persecution, when we are trying to define it, we can define it as to do harm to someone or a group of people. Or we can say it's a form of being cruel or a form of harassment. That is persecution. You are troubling someone. You are putting someone into a difficult situation, into a rather very difficult situation. You are persecuting them. You are causing harm to them. You are being very cruel to someone, or you are harassing someone. That is persecution. Right, we'll take it to the next question. That was question 2.1.4. We move on to the next question. Question 2.2. Give two names of any two vendor security branch policemen in the source implicated by Farisani during his interrogation. This is a level 1 extraction question. We just have to pick the names. It's Mr. James Limela and Mr. Magwaba. What does the statement, "I don't hate them, they must tell the truth," suggest about Farisani's testimony? I don't hate them, they must tell the truth. What does he tell us about the testimony? Right. It tells us that it was a truthful testimony without any bias or any exaggerations. He was being truthful in whatever he was testifying before the TRC. It was a truthful testimony without any bias or any exaggerated facts. By saying that he doesn't hate them, it means he was not taking a side. He was not exaggerating facts to make them appear bad, but rather he wanted them to tell the truth. He was telling exactly what happened without any bias or any exaggeration. Right. Suggest what the phrase, call on your God, he will come and help you, suggests about the tactics used by the security branch. When they ended up, because remember, he was serving in the church, and they ended up, when torturing him, saying that call on your God, he will come and help you. What tactics were they using? We can say they were ruthless in their act. They were using ruthless tactics in their interrogation. Or they were using inhuman tactics. They were being very cruel. They didn't fear God. If they go to the extent of telling him to call God and assist him, they didn't fear God using their tactics. They were just doing anyhow, behaving anyhow. And also, we can regard this as a blasphemy. They were being blasphemous. So their tactics were severe, were extreme, were inhuman, were unjustified in their effort to try and find information from the victims. Using the information in the source and your own knowledge, what can you conclude from the words? Unless they come out and confess, sooner or later they will come back, with reference to the perpetrators. It means if they didn't disclose, fully disclose this, if they didn't fully disclose, they were still going to be implicated in other cases. So these guys, because of the fact that they did not want to tell the truth, it was also going to be a recurring factor of them appearing before the TRC, being implicated in different torture and murder instances. So if they were not to disclose the truth, it also meant that they were going to come back again before the TRC because they were going to be implicated in other cases. Right. Why would a historian find this source reliable when researching how the TRC Human Rights Violations Committee dealt with the violations against Reverend Farisan? How is it a reliable? Right, let's check the source. When we're checking on reliability, we are saying it's a testimony given by Farisan, which implies that it's a first hand or it's a primary source. So when comparing sources, we say primary sources are more reliable than secondary sources. Primary sources are more likely to be reliable compared to secondary sources. So for the fact that it's a primary source, the first hand source, then it's more reliable. And also if we check the date, it was on 4 October 1996. It was also presented during the time of TRC hearings. It was during the time of TRC hearings, which coincide with the time of the TRC hearings. So it's more reliable for that fact. And also this source, if we check what he's saying here, is describing the brutality of the police. They poured water, like it says, I couldn't feel the electricity in the substance. They tried those electrical devices on my ears, they poured water, some water just falling on the floor. My whole body was just feeling pain. It is explaining the brutal measures that were taken by the police. It also corroborates with source 2A, which talks about torture, beatings, electric shocks. So the two sources, they are corroborating. So we can say it's reliable in the sense that it gives us information which is supportive to source 2A. It gives us almost the same information as source 2A, so we can safely rely because it corroborates with source 2A. Right, moving on to the next question. Quote one piece of evidence from the source, which suggests that the TRC Amnesty Committee was satisfied that the amnesty application by the three policemen complied with the requirements of the TRC Act. We just need to extract from the source 3.2c. It says, the TRC Amnesty Committee is satisfied that the applications comply with the formal requirements of the Promotion of National Unity and Reconciliation Act, which is the TRC Act. So that is where we get our evidence. That is where we get our evidence there from that very first part of our source. It gives us the clue by saying Amnesty Committee is satisfied with the applications that comply with the formal requirements of the Promotion of National Unity and Reconciliation Act, which is the TRC, which is the act. Right. Let's move on to the next question. It says, the three applicants, according to the source, who applied for amnesty for the assault and torture of Reverend Farisan, who were those three? We can safely find them in the source. The three applicants were T. Nesamari, P. Managa, and M. Ramalikela. Those were the three, according to the extract. Explain the term oral testimonies in the context of the TRC hearings. What were the oral testimonies in the context of the TRC hearings? Right. When we're talking of oral context, we are saying those are, this is question number 2.3.3. 2.3.3 is talking about oral testimonies. When I'm referring to oral testimonies, we are saying these are verbal, first-hand accounts from, can be victims, they can be victims, or they can be witnesses, or they can be the perpetrators, which are presented publicly. The TRC. So basically the idea of oral testimonies, we are saying those were verbal accounts or first-hand accounts by people who were victims or also people witnessing, and also those who were perpetrators of some injustices during apartheid that were presented before the TRC. So it's a first-hand account which is in the form of an oral presentation, which was done by the people involved in the event and which were presented before the TRC committee. Right. Taking the next question. Next question is saying, question number 2.3.4. What conclusion can be drawn from the statement? The TRC's amnesty committee is not satisfied that the above three applicants have made a full disclosure as required by the Act, what conclusion can be made? If the TRC committee is saying is not satisfied that the above three applicants have made a full disclosure, right? So the implication here is that the perpetrators left out some incriminating facts in their presentations. If the TRC is not satisfied, remember that one of the conditions for one to be granted amnesty, they were supposed to give a full disclosure, completely tell everything that happened. So in the presentation, it means that those three guys were selective. They did not disclose everything. They left out some incriminating evidence of their acts. And at the end, the TRC found out that they did not deserve to be granted amnesty for the fact that they did not make a full disclosure to their actions. Right, refer to source 2B and source 2C, explain how the evidence in source 2B supports the information in source 2C regarding the human rights violations committed against Reverend Farisani by the apartheid police. Right, what you need to do there, we just need to go to the sources and find how we can compare those sources. We want to find similarities on the actions. Right, source 2B and source 2C. We want to check source 2B. Source 2B is talking about if we check here, right, let's look at source 2B. It says they put a bag on me, they poured some glue-like things, you know, they were just sticky. My imagination, when they were shocking, I couldn't feel the electricity in the substance properly. Well, they tied those electrical devices in my ear. They poured water. Some water just on the floor. My whole body was just feeling pain. I fell in water and I was just falling down, rising and taking off the bag. Right. It's talking about usage of the bag here. And the same aspect is also portrayed here. The use of a bag filled with water over their heads. So the same information, the same ways of torture that were used, using a bag filled with water. Then it also talks about electrical devices. If we check here, we tied those electrical devices on my ears. Electrical devices are supported by the fact that they were using application of electric shocks. So it's supporting each other. Then also, if you check, it is talking about I was made to do press ups to stand on my head. And how can I stand on my top? Do press ups, stand on your head. How is it supported here? It's supported by the fact that instructions to do strenuous or tiring exercises. So you see how those sources are supporting each other. That is basically how we can figure out the support from the two sources in regard to human rights violations. Right. Then we are going to source 2D. Explain the symbolic representation of the following. Right. We are looking at this source. We have Dullah Omar. And we also have this presentation here, which is in frame of A and frame B. It says, it depicts Dullah Omar, the former Minister of Justice, who was responsible for the TRC, revealing the truth about human rights violations of political activists during the apartheid. So Dullah Omar is portrayed here. Then there are those frames with information from activists. Right, let's try to answer the questions. Our first question is saying, explain the symbolic or representation of the following. Dula Omar, what is he representing? We are saying Dula Omar is representing the TRC or is representing justice. Then the security policemen, they are representing apartheid or the injustices of apartheid. Comment on why the information in frame A differs from frame B regarding evidence presented to the TRC. Information in frame A, what is it saying and why is it differing? It says, the prisoner slipped on the soap, hit his head, and later died. That is frame A. Frame B is saying he hit him on his head, put a bag of over, shouldn't breathe attached to the battery. It is describing cruel methods of interrogation. So why are those two different? He screamed, he should not stop shaking, still wouldn't talk with an iron bar. It shows the cruelty. So the question is saying, comment on why the information differs. So in A is a perspective of a perpetrator. The perspective here is of a perpetrator who is ultimately denying responsibility. Why he is giving this account, he is denying responsibility over his actions. They murdered someone and they are now giving a perspective which is biased and saying the prisoner is slipped on a soap and hit on his head and later died. And if we check B here, whose account is it likely to be here? If we check the perspective of B, the perspective of B is a victim. Revealing the truth. About the torture. So why are those different? It's because it's a different perspective. Frame A is a perspective of a perpetrator who is trying to clear themselves from the injustice that they committed. They are trying to clear the ground off and they are trying to justify that they did not do any harm to the prisoner. The prisoner just slipped on a soap and they fell on their head and later on they died. But if you check the perspective of D, it is giving a clear, detailed description of how the person was tortured. So it's because of the differences in the perspective. The perpetrator does not want to be held responsible and the victim is ultimately telling the truth of what happened. That is why those two perspectives are different. Using the information in the relevant sources and your own knowledge, write a paragraph of about 8 lines explaining why the TRC rejected the amnesty applications of the perpetrators. Right. So again, it's a paragraph question in appeal format. The question is saying why the Truth and Reconciliation Committee rejected the amnesty applications. So you can start, you must start by addressing the question. The TRC rejected the applications because they did not meet the criteria of the granting of amnesty. According to the TRC Act. That's the answer to the question, an independent answer. Why were they rejected? They were rejected because they did not meet the criteria of being granted amnesty. Then you explain what is the criteria that was used to grant amnesty in your explanation? For one to be able to grant amnesty, to be granted amnesty, they were supposed to tell the truth. Tell all the truth of what happened. They were supposed to make a full disclosure of the events. They were supposed to disclose everything that happened. And they were supposed to prove that the motive was political. And also they were supposed to prove that it was not out of proportion. So if you check those conditions, those guys, they did not meet the criteria of full disclosure. The TRC found out that they did not fully disclose. Then you quote evidence from the sources to support the fact that the TRC rejected granting them amnesty. Then you link back to a line of argument. That is basically how you must answer the question in a paragraph format. And that is going to guarantee you that you would have given a response in a level 3 question, which shows synthesis of information. And apparently that is going to give you an 8 out of 8. Right, let's move on to our last question on source-based questions, which is question number 3. How might the expansion of BRICS countries be seen as a threat to the balance of power between the global north, which is Western countries, and the global south, which is the BRICS countries? Right, we are going to go through the questions and also try to figure out evidence from the sources in our attempt to give responses to those questions. Right, the first question is saying, when, according to the source, did the first meeting in the BRIC format take place? When it's a matter of time, we need to identify the time factor. The first meeting in the BRIC format took place on 20 September 2006. Name the 4 countries in the source who agreed to develop multifaceted cooperation amongst themselves in the formation of BRIC. It's again extraction question. We are seeing the meeting attended by ministers of foreign affairs of, it was Russia, Brazil, China, and India. It's a level 1, it's an extraction question. Right, the next question is saying, define the term summit. What is a summit? What is a summit? A summit, basically, it's a meeting. It's a high-profile meeting of heads of states or their delegates. So where heads of state meet or their delegates, that is a summit. Using information in the source and your own knowledge, explain the significance of 6 new countries joining BRICS on 1 January 2024. What is the significance of new countries joining BRICS on that? Basically, it's significant because it strengthens relations. It is a fueling factor in the strengthening of relations across the board. So relations between those countries are strengthened by those countries who are joining the formation. And also, it is important because it is significant because it stimulates economic growth of those countries. And any other reason that you might think of. Name any 2 strategic initiatives launched by BRICS in the source that aimed at challenging the established international order. 2 strategic initiatives. Name any 2 strategic initiatives. We are supposed to use the source using source B. BRICS is launching 3 strategic initiatives to challenge the establishment of international order. One is an artificial intelligence AI governance framework. Number 2, an independent economic system. And number 3, regional security coalitions or alliances. Those are the responses. Explain the concept de-dollarization in the context of the BRICS challenge to Western countries. What is de-dollarization in the context of BRICS challenge to? Right, when I'm talking of de-dollarization, this is question number 3.1. Is 3.2 2.2 is talking about de-dollarization. We are referring to the US dollar in this instance. So in simple terms, we are saying is the measure in the context, the measure by BRICS to remove or to replace the US dollar in their trading relations. So in the context of BRIC plus countries, we are saying they want to replace the US dollar. That is de-dollarization. They want to remove it and replace it with one of their member currencies or with a common currency among themselves. So it's a strategy or a measure to try and remove the usage of the dollar and replace it by the BRICS countries. Next question is saying, identify one reason in the source why BRICS countries attempted to influence the agricultural sector. Its extraction. Why are they trying to influence the agricultural sector? Another critical market BRICS is attempting to influence is the agricultural sector, whose first objective is to create an independent grain system. So they wanted to create an independent grain trading system that was introduced by Russia. So their objective there is to introduce or create an independent grain trading system similar to the one that was introduced by the USSR. Right. Then it says, question 2.4. Comment on how the diminished or reduced US influence would change the existing international order. The diminishing US influence, how would it change the international order? Right. So the international order, it is going to change in the sense that balance of power, the balance of power will shift and favor the South divide. Or the BRICS countries. They're the ones who are going to be favored by the balance of power. So international relations are going to change. The order of the world is going to change. Remember, the order of the world is in favor of the USA as a dominant country in the economics of the world. So with the growing power and the reduced or diminishing influence of the US on international communities, that's going to shift the balance of power in favor of the South divide, and to be specific, in the favor of the BRIC plus countries. It would also imply that emerging economies would dominate the market. For example, China, as a newly industrialized economy, we are seeing that is very progressing in terms of its level of GDP contribution to the world economy. And as a result, with a shift in power, with that decline in the dominance of the US on the international platform, it implies that the Chinese are going to come to the dominance on the international platform, because their growing power and their influence in the level of GDP across the international platform is actually giving them a share to become the dominating partners in the international community, combined with other partners in the BRIC formation. Then also, if we check, we can also argue to the effect that the US will no longer manipulate international affairs. International affairs. we are very aware that the US is responsible for manipulation of the international affairs through the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank. The USA has got dominance over international affairs, but however, through its loss of the grip on the domination part, through its diminishing influence, automatically it means it is going to lose its dominance on international affairs and also its control over the Bretton Woods institutions. Right. Then we are moving on to source C. What message is conveyed by the graph regarding the change in the G7's share of global GDP between 1995 and 2023, and also BRICS share of global between 1995 and 2023. Let's use the graph to try and figure out what the implication is. We see this is the G7 made of these countries: Britain, Canada, France, Italy, Germany, Japan, and the USA. Their share of the global GDP was 49.9 in 1995. They were having the highest share of global GDP at purchasing power parity. But if you check these other countries, the BRICS, they were having only 16.9. But if we check in 2023, we are seeing that the BRICS countries are now having 29.6. And the G7 are having 29, the BRICS are having 32.1. So we are seeing a change here. So the question is saying, what message is conveyed? What message is conveyed? So the message here is, for this G7, the message is the relative contribution to global GDP by the G7 countries, it significantly declined. Or we are saying the influence to the international GDP by the G7 countries, it fell from 1995 to 2025. That's the message there. They are losing influence on the share of global GDP. They are losing dominance. Then if we check on the BRICS, it was 16.9 in 1995, but rose to 32.1, which is above the G7 countries. So we can also suggest that the message is the BRIC is becoming a common formation and is becoming an influential formation in global GDP, as suggested by the figures here. It was slow in 1995, but now it's having dominance. So that's the message that you can derive from that illustration. Right, the next question is saying, using the information in the source and your own knowledge, explain the implication of the growth in China's GDP from 1995 to 2025. The implication of the growth, what does it imply? If we see here, China's share, China is the one at the bottom. It was this much in 1995, but here you see it is this much in 2023. So the question is saying, explain the implication of the growth. What is the implication of the growth of China's GDP contribution from 1995 to 2003? So the implication here is, we can say China is growing into a major world power. It shows that China is growing into a major world power, or because of rapid industrialization and investment in China. Have improved general lives of people in China. So it means people's living conditions have drastically improved. If you are seeing the contribution to the world GDP there, it suggests that because of rapid industrialization and also because of rapid investments and a widespread investment in the Chinese economy, we are seeing that China is ultimately having positive results in terms of the living conditions. And also the other implication is Chinese products are competing on the international platform. For China to realize such a growth, it means it's not only producing for its domestic market, it means it's also exporting. So the implication is with that growth in the level of GDP share, it means Chinese products are getting across the world. They are almost getting everywhere across the world, because why it is growing in GDP is because it has guaranteed markets on the international platform. So the implication is Chinese products are on the widespread on the international platform. They are being sold across the globe. Right, that takes us to the next question, which is question 3.4. Who, according to the source, was Trump referring to when he said, leave the dollar, you are not doing business with the US because we are going to put 100% tariff on your growth? That is source 3D. The statement is here. He was referring to the BRIC plus countries. That was whom he was referring to. Give a reason in the source why BRIC plus countries are critical of Bretton Woods era. They are critical of the Bretton Woods era. The Bretton Woods era we are referring to that era in history when countries decided to form the multilateral international platform of the IMF and the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Why are developing countries criticizing that development of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund? They see as benefiting the West, especially the United States, over the emerging global South. We are saying those multilateral international institutions, they are in favor of the developed world. They give credit facilities to the developed world. They do developmental projects for the developed world, especially the USA, and neglecting the poor South. Right. Then the next question is saying, using the information in the source and your own knowledge, explain why the fact that BRIC plus countries form 35% of the world's GDP and 45% of the world's population is a concern for US, Trump as a leader of the global north. Why is Trump concerned by the fact that those countries are contributing 35% of the world's GDP and their population is 45%? The implication here is these countries have got potential. Why he is concerned? He is threatened. By their potential to outscore the North. So we can say he's threatened by the fact that these countries still have potential. If we see their contribution is now at 35%, their population is 45%, which means they still have potential and capacity to further up their world's GDP contribution, and hence is threatened by them, which implies that they might take over control of the share of the GDP across the world and dominate the international platform. And any other relevant response that you might come out with. Comment on the usefulness of this source to a researcher studying how Trump felt by the expansion of BRICS. Comment on the usefulness. We want to identify usefulness of this particular source. But we can say the source is useful in the sense that it's an extract from a speech that Trump delivered. This can be used as usefulness. It's useful because it's an extract from a speech by Trump. And also, we can say it's useful in the sense that it tells us that the US is going to impose or put 100% tariff on the growth of BRIC plus countries. And also, it tells us that Western-friendly countries like Turkey wish to join alliances of BRIC plus countries. So it's very useful information that we can get there. It also gives us the image that even those countries who are supporting the West, they are also willing to come and join the BRIC, who is an enemy of the US. Right. Then we move on to the next question. Refer to source 3C and 3D. Explain how the evidence in 3C supports information in 3D regarding how BRICS is upsetting the balance of power. Right. If you check source 2C, 3C, 3C is talking about the growth by BRICS. 3C is giving us the growth by BRICS countries in terms of their GDP share from 16.9 to 31.9. And is supported by the fact that they are contributing 35% of the world's GDP share. So it's supported in that sense. And also it shows us about the increase in contribution by China. China was there, and we are seeing its contribution increasing there. How is it supported? We are told that China was involved in a trade war. Trump started a trade war with China to show that China is a threat because it's a fast-growing economy. Trump ended up involving himself in a trade war. So it's supporting each other. First source is telling us that the Chinese GDP contribution increased sharply from 1995 to 2023. And also we are seeing Trump engaging in a trade war because of the threats being posed by China. Right. Then the last question is a paragraph question. Using the information in the relevant sources and your own knowledge, write a paragraph about 8 lines explaining how. The question is saying, explaining how the BRIC expansion of BRIC countries might be seen as a threat to the balance of power. How? Right. You can start your paragraph with a point, clear point, and explanation and evidence and your link. Right. How? You can start by saying the BRIC countries are growing significantly in their level of contribution how can it be a threat? Is a threat because of their growing influence. The BRIC countries are growing significantly in their level of GDP contribution to global GDP. And this is going to threaten the world balance of power. How is it going to threaten? We are seeing that there is now an issue of expansion in the south, which is going to threaten the north. The more the south grows, it implies that the balance of power is going to shift to the direction of the south, because now they are the ones who are able to manipulate international economic activities. Then you quote evidence from relevant sources to support the effect, and then you link back to the line of argument. And that takes us to the end of our source-based section. We have to move on to section B, which is our essay section. And in this section, we do not want to exhaust much of your concentration and much of your energy. We want just to focus on how you structure your essay and the brief ideas that you can use in your essay. The first question is saying, the philosophy of Biko and the Black Consciousness Movement revived the resistance to apartheid in South Africa from the 1960s to the 1970s. Do you agree with the statement? Use relevant evidence to support your line of argument. So the statement is saying the philosophy of Biko and the Black Consciousness Movement revived the resistance to apartheid in South Africa from the 1960s. Right. So that's the focus. That's the statement, the guiding statement, the guiding historical statement to our question, which we must base our argument on. So we are looking at the revival of resistance to apartheid in South Africa. We are saying we give it credit to Biko and the Black consciousness movement. Can we agree to the effect that it is Black consciousness and Steve Biko's ideas that revived the resistance to apartheid? Right. So I will structure the essay in such a way. The most definite, because we know that Black consciousness played a significant role in the revival of protests against apartheid. So this is question 4. Your introduction, how must you structure it? Structure your introduction in a way that you have 1, your answer to the question. Then you have 2, reasons. Then you have number 3, an elaboration. That is what you want. For every essay, you must have those 3 in the introduction. So I'm going to use number 4 as an example. Your answer, the question is saying, do you agree? So you can start by in agreement, or it is agreeable, or you can say 1 can agree. Right. Avoid using the first person, I agree. It is in agreement, or it is agreeable, or 1 can agree. Agree what? That the ideas of Biko revived the challenge. You don't necessarily need to copy the statement. You have to rephrase the statement. But the main idea is there must be an answer. So your answer is there. You are agreeing to the effect that it is Black consciousness and Steve Biko's ideas that were very influential in the revival of the challenge to apartheid. Why are we saying so? We need to justify by giving general reasons in our introduction. We must highlight general reasons as to why we are agreeing to the effect that it is Black consciousness that was influential in the challenge against apartheid. Right. The BC helped Black people to be self-reliant. It's a reason, or you can say it is through Black consciousness that Black people got to realize their pride, or Black people got to realize their cultural identity. You are giving general reasons why you are saying it revived protests. It revived the challenge against apartheid. Then give an elaboration. What historical evidence are you going to use in the essay? What is the essay about? Maybe this essay is going to shed more light on the influence of Biko's ideas in reviving resistance against apartheid. That is a complete introduction. With those 3 given, your introduction is contextualized and is complete. Then you go to your ideas. Remember also there's background information, but I don't advise you to waste time on the background information because remember, there are no marks for the background information. You can just include the background information as just in passing, but don't waste time on the background information because there are no marks for that. And also remember that you must not put any subheading, you must not highlight, you must not put any bullets, no telegram writing, you must use continuous writing. So the background basically talk about of Black consciousness. You look at repression by apartheid government. The repression in 1960, after Sharpeville massacre, where you look at the banning of ANC and PAC. Then you also look at the influential activists. Some of them were imprisoned. The imprisonment of activists, and also you look at some of the imprisonment were in exile. They had gone out of South Africa for fear of their life. And also you look at underground operations. So because of all this, the government managed to also look at the government instituting state of emergencies. All these measures here, they were very strictly repressive on the black community, such that there was very minimal resistance against apartheid, which was brought by the turning points in South African history of the Sharpeville massacre. And we are seeing the ANC being banned, which meant it was declared illegal. It was not supposed to do its operations in South Africa. And also the Pan-African Congress under Robert Sobukwe was also banned by the very same time. And we see the imprisonment of key figures who were mobilizing people to challenge the government. And also we see some of the influential people getting into exile. And the ANC was operating underground, was operating in hiding because it was an illegal organization. And also we see the influence of state of emergencies. People can no longer go on the streets to protest because the government had put in place very harsh and restrictive measures on any form of strike action. So because of this, it gave the apartheid government an upper hand, which meant that it had managed to suppress any form of resistance. And also we can include the banning of people here. There were some people who were also banned. People who were influential, they were also banned. And also we talk of repression in terms of detention without trial. Because of all these strict measures, there was very limited resistance to apartheid. But however, we are saying black consciousness revived. After all this, there was minimal resistance. The government had managed to suppress any form of resistance against its operations. So black consciousness came in now to revive the protests. So when you're explaining about black consciousness, I'm not going to dwell much on the points, but I'm just going to highlight. You can talk of aspects like Steve Biko University, breaking away from the NUSAS to form SASO. You explain how it influenced the black university students and how it conscientized them of the need to realize their self-worth. Then you also look at the black consciousness on trade unionism. It's another effect. How did black consciousness influence workers to challenge against apartheid? You look at aspects like the Black Allied Workers Union. How was it influential in the fight against oppression of workers in the workplace? And also, you look at the influence of the South African student movement for schools. How it was mobilizing learners in schools because they were infused with the ideas of black consciousness from the teachers coming from universities. And also you look at aspects like the 1976 rejection of Africans by learners as a tool to show that there was a revival of protests, of challenge against apartheid. You look at the Soweto uprising and the events thereafter. You look at aspects like the Black People's Convention, how black people got to unite and fight against oppression in a united force. Then also look at other movements, other formations, like you look at said Black People's Convention. You look at trade unionism. We've talked about that, where we looked at the Black Allied Workers Union. You look at the role of the media. You can give examples of journals published by Steve Biko, like the Black Review, how it revived the spirit of challenge against apartheid. You look at black consciousness as a philosophy itself, as a way of life of the black people, where it was encompassing aspects of cultural identity, where it was upholding the principle of self-assertiveness, where it encouraged black people to do away with the shackles of colonization, where it encouraged Black people to act with pride. All these aspects, you can explain them and show how Black consciousness revived the fight against apartheid. Then you can also explain and talk about aspects of the Viva Frelimo rallies. After the independence of Mozambique in 1976, it revived the spirit of South Africans. They became optimistic that if independence is prevailing in the region, then why won't South Africa also gain its own independence? So it revived the spirit of challenge against apartheid because of the independence that was prevailing in the region. Angola was also independent by that time. So we see those ideas and how they helped to revive protests. Look at aspects of self-reliance. You talk of community projects in the Black societies, trying to uphold and uplift the lives of the Black people in the societies through, for example, winter school programs, and also through aspects of the trust funds and also some other different kinds of projects that were held in the rural African societies. Right. So if you look at those aspects, that can guarantee you that you can have a very good essay, but always remember that you must present your ideas in a way which is in the format of a pill. And at the end, you reach your conclusion, you tie up your argument, you reaffirm the key point, then you conclude your essay, refer back to the line of argument, and then reaffirm some key points. Then you conclude your essay that way. Then that will guarantee you of a very good presentation of historical facts. Right. Then we move on to the next question. We're going to use the same format here. The next question is a question based on the coming of democracy to South Africa, which is a negotiated settlement. The negotiated settlement is the coming of democracy to South Africa. So we are going to analyze the question and try to figure out how best we can respond to the essay question. And most importantly, we must figure out how best we can structure our introduction so that it's contextualized. Right. The road to democracy was characterized by a non-violent process of negotiation. Critically discussed this statement with reference to the period between 1990 and 1994. It was featured by a non-violent process. Right. So we are critically discussing here. Remember, when you're answering a critical discussion question, we must, in our introduction, try to figure out whether we must adopt a positive line of argument or a negative line of argument, which means we must approve the statement or disapprove the statement, depending on the context, historical context, and the non-facts to the event in question. So if the question is saying the road to democracy was characterized by a non-violent process of negotiation, we understand that there were events of violence that happened during the process, which almost brought to a halt the negotiation process. So we cannot approve that statement. It was by a non-violent, but at the same time, there were instances of violence through the process of negotiation. So our line of argument, we must adopt the main line of argument, but we must give a counter argument. Right. So we need to have an answer. Our answer are either approving the statement or disapproving the statement, and we must have a dual line of argument. Right. So we can say in this, the process was featured by a non-violent process, but however, we can say it was featured largely by a non-violent process, but however, there were instances of disturbing violence. You see, we are adopting a dual line of argument. There's a main line of argument. It was largely non-violent, but however, there were instances of disturbing violence. Then you highlight the reasons. Why are you saying it was non-violent? You highlight on events of negotiation that were successful, and also highlight on incidences of violence that almost disturbed the process. But you're not explaining them here, you're just highlighting. Then you give the elaboration. What are you going to present in the essay? What is the essay about? That's the last part. Then your introduction is contextualized. It has a dual line of argument, and it has reasons for the main argument and counter reasons, and also it has an elaboration. Then you go towards your body of the essay. Remember, this essay is an essay that you must follow some form of chronological order of the series of negotiation events. So it's a negotiated settlement essay, and you must always remember that the events, you must try to present them in their sequence of the historical timeline. You cannot go to 1994, you talk about the democratic elections in South Africa, then you go to the Krutska Minute, then you go to the Pretoria Minute, then you go to the Record of Understanding in a disorderly manner. You are supposed to figure out those events in a sequence of their timeline of historical occurrence, such that it has a sequence and it has chronology in terms of the sequence of the events when you are presenting them. It is unjustified for you to just pick out events and do not follow the timeline, because this is a sequence of events from 1990 going to 1994, where South Africa was transformed from being an apartheid state to become a democratic state, with the first elections held and the first Black president getting into office. Right, so what you need to note there, you can start on de Klerk's parliamentary speech. We see de Klerk promising an end to an era of violence. That was on 2 February 1990. He promised the release of political prisoners and the return of exiles. That was the beginning point. And also, we can see the unbanning of political parties. The ANC was unbanned. And the unbanning of activists is another move that you can describe, which was a positive. Then we can also look at the release of Nelson Mandela on an unconditional basis. That paved the way for the rise to the process of negotiation. That was on 11 February 1990. Then we go on to look at one of the major events. You look at Sebokeng violence. Before that, we can look at the release of Nelson Mandela as a crucial factor. It paved the way for the beginning of the negotiation process before we look at the violence. Right. Then we look at the first meeting, which was the Krutska Minute, which was held on the 2nd of May 1990. And after that meeting, we can also look at other events that followed, like the event that almost derailed the negotiation process, violence in Sebokeng. Remember, we said there was also disturbing violence. So when you are linking your violent event, you link it to the fact that there was violence, which was almost disturbing the negotiation process. It almost derailed the progress of the negotiation process. So you highlight in the favor of the main argument that it was largely non-violent, but you also highlight and figure out a violent event and link it to the fact that there were instances of disturbing violence throughout the negotiation process. Like that Sebokeng violence, you explain how it led to an almost derailment of the beginning of the negotiation process. Then we go to the Pretoria Minute. The Pretoria Minute, it was held on the 6th of August, 1990. And what was agreed there? The ANC agreed that they were supposed to suspend the armed struggle. The Umkhonto they were supposed to cease its operations. You highlight the discussion, the negotiation process, and also you highlight on the agreements that were made on that particular process of negotiation. Then we continue to go on to the CODESA 1, Convention for a Democratic South Africa 1. Then you look at the political parties which were engaged there at the World Trade Center in Kempton Park, where 19 parties participated, and you also look at other political parties that refused to participate. The AZAPO, the Communist Party, and the PAC, they refused to participate, mainly under the influence of the fact that they did not want to engage in formal talks. And it almost derailed again. It was a disturbing process that AZAPO and also the Communist Party and also the Pan-African Congress refused to participate or to take part in the CODESA 1. Then you go on to look at the Ingata also refused the IFP under King Buthelezi. Mangosuthu Buthelezi, they refused to also participate. Then also you look at incidents of violence across the country, violence in Natal. It will almost derailed the process again. Then we go on after the violence, we look at the referendum, the whites-only referendum, where the whites were seeking for opinion whether they were supposed to continue with the negotiation or they were supposed to stop the negotiation process. But however, it was in favor of the continuation of the negotiation process because mainly the economy was sanctioned, it was now performing poorly, and also it threatened the viability of business. And hence, people who were involved in economic activities were advocating for the negotiation process to continue so that they will rescue the failing economy and resustain whatever was remaining. Then we go on to look at CODESA 2. You explain what happened with CODESA 2. Unfortunately, CODESA did not realize positive results because of the struggle in power sharing deals. The power sharing strategy did not realize positive results in terms of CODESA 1 and 2. And by the end of the CODESA 2, they felt that CODESA was a shunned name. It did not produce any positive results and was supposed to be abandoned. And also, before we look at the abandonment of CODESA as a title of negotiation, we also have to look at other things that happened there. There was incidents of violence in Boipatong. There was the Boipatong massacre, and also that was 17 June 1992. And also we look at the Biso massacre, which also happened there. The Biso massacre, which was on 7 September 1992. We explained these events as disturbing violent events which almost derailed and brought to a standstill to the negotiation process. Then one of the key events, we look at the assassination of Chris Hani. Chris Hani assassination, and how did it impact? It led to widespread protests. It was a disturbing event. People protested against the assassination, and apparently it led to tensions. Then also we look at the record of understanding. And also need to look at the AWB, how they disturbed the negotiation process at World Trade Center when they broke in the trade center in their armored vehicle and tried to disperse the negotiators in the process. It was also an incident of disturbing violence by the right-wing AWB. Right, and also we look at the record of understanding, which resumed negotiation after a deadlock. It was a commitment by Cyril Ramaphosa, who is now the current president, and by the end was a secretary, and Rolf Meyer, who was the Minister of Constitutional Development. We give credit to those two guys who resumed the negotiation process and signed the record of understanding. Then we go on to look at other incidents of disturbing violence. We look at the St. James. St. James church bombing. It was an instance of disturbing violence. Then also we look at other instances of disturbing violence, both Botswana, and also we look at the final agreement when we come to the end, that elections were supposed to be reached on the 27th of April. And then we see the ANC winning. And then first black president. The first black South African president who came in the form of Nelson Mandela. So basically, those are the processes. So when you're explaining, you link them to either they were instances of violence or they were instances of non-violent events. So that will build up your essay, and that will build up the ideas of the essay until you get to the conclusive part of the essay, which is the conclusion. You reach your conclusion, you tie up your argument. To show that there was violence, you refer back to the line of argument. To show that the process was largely non-violent, but there were some other instances of disturbing violence that almost derailed the success of the negotiation process between the white National Party government and black liberal movements. Right, that takes us to the end of question number 5, which is a question on the road to democracy. Then the last question is question number 6. Explain to what extent Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika in the 1980s ultimately led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Use relevant historical evidence to support your line of argument. Right, you are supposed to analyze the extent to which the policies by the coming of Mikhail Gorbachev into the helm of the USSR, how it influenced the fall of the Soviet Union. We understand that the Soviet Union was an extreme communist state which relied on government control over all economic activities, which dominated all the terrain of the political environment and the economic environment. The government was responsible for managing all such. But through the coming of new leadership and the change in the world and the distribution of power across the world, the coming to an end of the Cold War tensions, it ultimately brought in new ideas. And also the failure of the USSR to sustain itself, it also brought in the need to give in new ideas to the communist ideology and bring in the ideas of the glasnost and also the perestroika. So you have to adopt a line of argument for your answer. In this instance here, I advise you to take the extent that it is to a larger extent. To a greater extent, those ideas, they brought to the fall, they brought the USSR to its downfall. The idea by Mikhail Gorbachev, the idea of perestroika and the idea of glasnost. So it is to a greater extent. Perestroika and glasnost brought the downfall of the USSR to a greater extent. Why are we saying so? What was the idea? When you look at the idea of perestroika, it meant openness. Openness. And when you talk of glasnost, we are saying it allowed criticism of the government actions. So we are seeing a communist state here where there is dictatorial leadership. You must not criticize the state, and you cannot do Like, you are not guaranteed that you must be accountable for your actions as the government. The government does what it wills for the people. And even if there's no transparency, the government is still not liable for its failures in delivering whatever it's supposed to deliver to the people. Because the government has ultimate control and there's no openness there. The government does what it does in its own favor without anyone questioning them. So by that, we are saying the economy got to be transformed. So the reason that you can give there is the ideas of perestroika and glasnost allowed for openness in the government's operations, and also it allowed for open criticism of the government. So we are seeing that if there are those elements in the running of the government, of a communist government, it is likely to bring to a downfall of the communist society in that instance. Then you give your elaboration. What is the essay about? Then you highlight on the ideas that you're going to present or the historical facts. Then the ideas that you can use in your essay are just in brief. You highlight on the ideas of perestroika, and you show how it brought to a downfall of the communist society. Because in this instance, our question is saying, to what extent policies of perestroika and glasnost led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. You relate to perestroika, how did it operate? Perestroika, we're saying, allowed criticism of the government, which was an unknown culture of communism. In pure communistic society, you cannot criticize the government unless if you want to go to jail or if you want to lose your life. So perestroika allowed for such. It allowed open criticism for the government. Whatever the government was doing, it we're looking at glasnost here. Whatever the government was doing, it allowed for open criticism of whatever actions that the government was taking. So it meant that the fact that there was openness, it allowed for criticism by the government, such that people were able to criticize whatever action the government was doing. And apparently it meant that the government was going to lose power because it was facing criticism. Automatically it was becoming unpopular, unlike in pure communist, whereby you don't have a chance to ultimately criticize the government. It's an unknown culture. And also, if you look at perestroika, how did it impact? It allowed small private ownership. And also, what did it do? In top of allowing small private ownership, it removed government control over production. Removed government control over production. So it meant that the influence of the government on the economy was gradually being lost. If you are now allowing small private ownership, is a culture which is also anti-communistic. Because remember, under communism, we advocate for equality. We cannot allow private individuals to run their own initiatives, because that will further entrench inequality in the society. But in this instance, we are seeing the government advocating for private ownership and also removing government control over production. That is a culture which is shifting away from the traditional communist society. So we are seeing the weakening of the communist system in Russia by the ideas of Mikhail Gorbachev. Then we can also look at those ideas, glasnost and perestroika. What did they do? It led to demands to end communism and adopt full democracy. Because of those ideas, people in Russia, they were demanding that we must end this communist society. We are not tired of it. It is not functional. Then we must adopt new ideologies. Let's adopt the ideology of democracy. So apparently it led to end of communism and the Cold War tensions. Because of those ideas, it led to the end of the Cold War tensions and also the end of communism. And Russia was no longer a superpower. The significant changes in Russia. Russia was no longer a superpower after the adoption of those ideas. And we see that as time went by, communism became a non-threat. It was no longer seen as a threat to the globe. It ceased to become a global threat because it was led down by the main communist society, who was the USSR. So because of these ideas of glasnost and the ideas of perestroika, you explain how those ideas they influenced the mentality of the people of Russia, how they influenced the mindset of the people of Russia, leading to how they influenced people to adopt a drastic change from strict communist cultural practices like centralized control to a semi-privately controlled country. And with also the transition of the government losing control over production, it also meant that the communist main ideology was being dropped gradually, because we understand that in a pure communist society, we have the government dominating production and regulating all economic activity in the pretext of providing or attaining a socially equitable economy. But we are seeing that Russia was gradually, because of the introduction of the ideas of perestroika, it gradually disallowed the effect of strict control by the government over production, and also it allowed for some form of decentralization of power and production to small entrepreneurs to be allowed to just run their own businesses, which meant that there was a shift in the ideology of pure communist to now a partly capitalistic society, where we're now allowing private individuals to be taking charge of control of economic activity and also to be in charge of production. So we see those ideas, and also the idea of glasnost, the fact that we adopt openness or transparency. It's also an anti-communist ideology. There should be no transparency in communist societies. The government must do whatever it does. Whatever the government is doing, you must believe and assume that the government is doing it in your favor. They are doing it for the sake of attaining equitable income distribution. They are doing it for the sake of attaining social welfare, for the welfare of every living individual in the society. They are targeting to achieve equality. So with openness, we are saying the government was now accountable over its decision. It was supposed to act transparently, which means that whatever shortcuts the government was taking was supposed to be accountable for it. So that pretext, again, it brought in the downfall of the USSR. Its strong influence over the people was lost, because it was now supposed to be accountable over its actions. It was supposed to operate in a transparent manner. So those changes, they signify that the adoption of a pure communist society by the USSR was gradually being lost along the way, with the change of leadership along the timeline. It brought in those significant changes, and the major changes were brought in by Mikhail Gorbachev. Then when we're bringing to an end your essay, you tie up your argument to show that those principles, they led to the downfall of the Soviet Union. The principle of glasnost, you are referring back to a line of argument, they, to a large extent, they significantly contribute, or they are the major factors that led to the downfall of the USSR. And then you reaffirm your key points, and then you tie up your argument in that sense. So basically, that was question number 6, which is the end of Cold War and the New World Order. So with that being said and done, I think that has taken us to the end of this discussion, to the end of this paper 2 history discussion. We are going to meet in other discussions to follow. Your host in history. Thank you for watching.